Salam and peace be upon you, my dear listener. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning together. There is one field called phi, spelled Phi. Phi is the holophase, a cyclic rhythm defined at every point in the universe. Its first derivatives give three simultaneous echoes: time, which we call omega, spelled Omega, space, which we call k, and motion, which we call v, built from both omega and k. Above them, higher derivatives form a branching tree that, in principle, goes on forever. Every law of nature is a pattern in this tree of derivatives of phi. Today, we zoom into just one branch of that tree. In part 19, we walked with waves. We watched patterns moving through air, water, and light. We met two kinds of speed. The first was pattern speed, also called phase velocity, which tells us how fast the repeating crests of a wave move. The second was message speed, also called group velocity, which tells us how fast a packet of waves, a little lump of information, travels. We saw that the universe never sends a pure infinite wave. It always sends packets, little wave words, and those packets move according to the deeper grammar that ties omega and k together. That grammar is called dispersion, and it can be tested in the lab. Today, in part 20, we ask a very simple but powerful question. When a pattern exists in the holophase field, how strong is it? Not just how fast does it move, but how intense is it? How active is it? How much does it want to do something? We are going to meet a new layer of the holophase language. We will not add new letters to the alphabet. Instead, we will learn how to combine the letters we already know into simple measures of activity. These combinations are like measuring how loud the sound is, or how bright a light is, or how strong a wave is, using only the letters of the phi language. We will keep this as simple as possible. No equations on a screen, only pictures in your mind and words that you can feel. Let us begin with a very human example. Imagine you are watching two children jump on a trampoline. The first child jumps gently with small up and down motions. The second child jumps wildly, going high into the air and crashing back down again and again. If you had to say which one has more activity, you would not hesitate. The second child is clearly more active. There is more motion, more change, more intensity. Now imagine you could not see the children. You could only listen to sensors attached to the trampoline. One sensor measures how quickly the height of each child changes in time. When the child is almost still, the measurement is small. When the child launches into the air, the measurement is larger. If you square this measurement, you get something that no longer cares whether the child is going up or down, only how strong the change is. Small changes, when squared, give very small numbers. Large changes, when squared, give much larger numbers. So the square becomes a very simple measure of activity. The holophase language does something very similar. We already met omega, the local ticking rate of the phase. Omega tells us how fast phi is changing in time at a point. Think of omega as the tempo of the internal clock of reality at that place. Now imagine taking omega and forming omega times omega, or omega squared. You do not need to see the symbol, just hear this. Omega squared is simply how intense the time change is at that point. It does not care whether the phase is moving forward or backward along the circle, only how strong the motion is. Where omega is small, omega squared is tiny. The local phase is barely changing in time. The internal clock is almost frozen. Where omega is large, omega squared is big. The local phase is spinning fast in time. The internal clock is racing. In the holophase language, we can think of omega² as a simple measure of temporal activity, a way of saying how busy is reality here in the time direction. Now let us step sideways into space. We also met K, the letter K, the spatial pattern vector. K tells us how quickly phi changes as you move in space. If K is small, the pattern in space is smooth, like a gentle hill. If K is large, the pattern changes rapidly, like sharp ripples. To measure spatial activity, we can do something very similar to what we did with omega. We can look at the size of K, the magnitude of K, and multiply it by itself. We can form what physicists call K², or more precisely, the magnitude of K². Again, you do not need to see the symbol, just remember this sentence. The magnitude of K² is a simple way to measure how intense the spatial change is. If K is almost zero, K² is tiny. The phase is nearly flat across space. If K is large, K² is big. The phase is rapidly twisting and weaving. So now we have two simple measures. One for time activity, based on omega². One for space activity, based on the magnitude of K². You can picture them as two sliders on a sound mixing board. The first slider, omega², tells you how intense the time rhythm is at a point. The second slider, K², tells you how sharp the spatial pattern is at that point. Together, they give you a first idea of how much is happening in the phase field there. Let us pause here and translate this back into everyday life. Imagine a calm lake on a still day. The water surface is almost flat. There is no wind, no rain, no stones falling in. The patterns in space are gentle and almost absent. K is small. K² is tiny. Also, nothing much is changing in time. Omega is small. Omega² is tiny. The lake is in a low activity state, both temporally and spatially. Now imagine a violent storm over the same lake. Strong wind is whipping the surface. Waves are tall. Crests are close together. The spatial pattern is sharp and intense. K is large. K² is large. The patterns are also changing quickly in time. Crests are rising and falling fast. Omega is large. Omega² is large. The lake is in a high activity state in both space and time. We have not changed the material of the lake. It is still water. But the activity level of the phase patterns in that water is very different. This is how the holophase language begins to speak about intensity. Not as some mysterious extra thing, but as a simple combination of how fast phases change in time and how rapidly they vary in space. From a linguistic point of view, omega and K were the letters that told us about rhythm and spacing. Omega² and K² are like measuring how loud or bold those letters are written in a sentence. Now let us add another step. Up to this point, we have treated temporal activity and spatial activity separately. But the holophase language is always about relationships. Time, space, and motion are not independent. They are echoes of the same underlying phase. So it is natural to ask, how do these two sliders, omega² and K², balance each other? Imagine you are an artist designing a pattern on a drum skin. You want to paint regions of calm and regions of intensity. You could decide that you want the total activity to be the difference between temporal intensity and spatial intensity. In a very simple picture, you might write something like, total activity here is omega² minus K². Please do not worry about the symbols, just hear the structure. Temporal activity minus spatial activity. Why might this matter? Because in some systems in physics, Patterns that nature favors are those that strike a balance between time change and space change. In such systems, if temporal activity is too strong compared to spatial activity, the pattern will adjust. If spatial activity is too strong compared to temporal activity, the pattern will adjust the other way. The minus sign between omega² and k² becomes a kind of balance rule. It says, in effect, the universe will only allow patterns where this balance is satisfied. This is still very abstract. Let us ground it with a picture. Think of a tightrope walker crossing between two buildings. On one side of the rope are the forces pulling them to move faster in time, to hurry across. On the other side are the forces pulling them to move in space in complicated ways, swinging, wobbling, losing balance. The tightrope walker must constantly adjust, trying to find a balance order where neither the temporal rush nor the spatial wobble dominates. If they lean too much into spatial chaos, they fall. If they try to rush too fast without controlling their steps, they also fall. Now imagine that instead of a human, this balancing act is happening in the phase field itself. The desire of the field is not conscious, of course, but its equations favor certain patterns. Patterns with too much temporal activity and too little spatial structure are unstable. Patterns with too much spatial twisting and not enough temporal rhythm are also unstable. The only stable patterns are those that sit on a thin tightrope of balance between omega² and k². In physics, this often shows up as something called an action principle, where patterns that nature actually realizes are those that make a certain combined measure of activity as small as possible or stationary. In our language, we can think of it very loosely as the universe preferring sentences in the phi language that respect a certain balance between time change and space change. We do not need to go into the formal mathematics here. For our audio journey, it is enough to hold this intuition. Omega² and k² are like two competing colors of activity. The patterns we see in reality are those where these colors balance in a specific way. And crucially, that balance can be tested. You can go into the lab, measure how patterns in a material behave, and see whether the combinations of omega and k that actually occur follow the predicted balance rule. You can check whether the waves that survive and propagate are those that keep total activity near a special value, while other patterns quickly fade. So even though we are telling this as a gentle story, it is tied to experiments. It is falsifiable. If you find waves in a material that break the predicted balance, then the holophase description for that material must be corrected. Let us make all of this more concrete with 3 short stories about activity. First, imagine a guitar string again. When it is at rest, both omega² and k² are effectively zero. There is no vibration in time, no pattern in space. Now you pluck the string gently. It begins to vibrate in its simplest mode, with one smooth bulge in the middle. The temporal activity, omega², rises from 0 to some moderate value. The spatial activity, k², also rises, but not extremely. The pattern is smooth and simple. If you pluck harder, you increase the amplitude, the size of the motion, and the activity measures grow. The string may also begin to oscillate in more complex modes, with more wiggles along its length. Now k becomes larger, and k² becomes larger. Temporal activity and spatial activity both rise. The pattern is more intense in every way. The voice of the string, its sound and timbre, is shaped by these activity levels. The holophase language could describe this by assigning simple activity measures based on omega and k and their combination. Second, imagine a laser beam. In vacuum, light travels with a very special balance between time and space changes. Its activity pattern is such that temporal and spatial parts are related in a tightly constrained way. If you try to create a pattern of light that does not respect this balance, the pattern simply will not propagate in vacuum. It will not be a permitted sentence in the holophase language of empty space. Inside a glass fiber, the balance changes. The material modifies the dispersion and the allowed activity combinations. If you send in a pulse of light that matches the allowed balance, it can travel kilometers with almost no distortion. If you send in a pattern that does not match, it quickly spreads out and dies. Third, think about your brain. Your brain is full of rhythmic activity. Brain waves at different frequencies, spatial patterns of firing across the cortex, bursts of synchronous and asynchronous behavior. The holophase language would describe all of these as patterns of omega and K in an effective phase field that lives in the neural tissue. Some patterns are weak and vanish quickly. Their activity measures never cross a threshold. Some patterns are strong and self-sustaining. They manage to keep a special balance between temporal and spatial activity, supported by the connectivity and chemistry of the brain. These correspond to stable rhythms, the alpha rhythms, beta rhythms, and so on, that neuroscientists record. Here again, the idea of activity is not just poetry. It can be linked to what we can measure with electrodes and scanners. We can ask, when does a brain rhythm persist and when does it die out? What combinations of change in time and change in space seem to be favored? In principle, this can be framed as a question about the holophase activity measures in that context. Let us now zoom back out to the master tree. Our alphabet started with phi itself, silent under shift symmetry. Then its first derivatives, omega, k, the combined change d phi, and the motion echo v. Then we climbed into second derivatives that describe curvature, focusing, and convergence. Then we met topology, the knots and defects. Then we explored waves and messages and the two kinds of velocity, pattern speed and message speed. Activity measures like omega² and k² sit as simple, quadratic combinations near the lower branches of this tree. They do not introduce new letters. They are short, powerful words built from the letters we already know. They tell us, at each point in space and time, how strong is the local rhythm, how sharp is the local pattern. And when we combine them, they hint at a deeper law of selection. Among all possible sentences that phi could in principle write, the universe seems to choose those where certain balances of activity are respected. For our audio journey, you can think of part 20 as our first attempt to listen not just to the shape of the language, but to its volume and emphasis. Before, we asked what words and grammar nature uses. Now we ask, with what intensity does it speak those words? This is still only the beginning. Later, when we move beyond episode 6, we will see how these activity measures grow into full energy-like quantities, action principles, and deep conservation laws. But here, it is enough to understand the seed. Take the basic alphabet of change. Square the letters to measure how strong they are. Combine those strengths to see which patterns are favored. You do not need formulas on a page to feel this. Next time you watch waves on water, or feel loud music through your chest, or sense the quiet stillness of a calm room, think of omega² and k² as invisible sliders that the universe is constantly adjusting. In the storm, both sliders are high. In the calm lake, both are low. In a laser beam, they are finely balanced. In your brain, they rise and fall as thoughts and feelings come and go. You are not just living in this language, you are made of it. Every heartbeat, every breath, every firing neuron is a small act of balancing activity in the holophase field. Before we close, I want to sit a little longer with one key idea, because it is easy to hear these words and let them float past. Omega², k², activity, balance. These can sound abstract. So let us go slowly, as if we are teaching a child, but a very intelligent child who can feel ideas deeply. First, Why do we square things at all? Why not just look at omega by itself, or k by itself? Imagine you are measuring how far you walk each day. Some days you walk north, some days you walk south. If you simply add all your signed distances, you can get 0, even if you walked a lot. For example, you walk 5 kilometers north in the morning and 5 kilometers south in the evening. If you treat north as positive and south as negative, +5 and -5 add to 0. If you look only at that total, you might say, I did nothing today. But your legs will tell you the truth. They are tired. They know you walk 10 kilometers, not 0. To capture the true effort, you need a measure that does not cancel opposite directions. One simple way is to square the distances. 5 squared is 25 for the morning, 5 squared is 25 for the evening, and together they make 50. Now the activity is not cancelled by walking in the opposite direction. It accumulates. Omega is like that signed distance. Sometimes the phase moves one way around the circle, sometimes the other. If you only look at the direction, you can cancel activity. Omega² is like counting the total effort, regardless of direction. It is a way of saying, how hard is the phase working in time here, without letting forwards and backwards cancel. The same story holds in space. If the phase pattern twists one way in one region and the opposite way in a neighboring region, adding those twists in a signed way can give you a small result, or even 0. But physically, the pattern may still be very rough and active. The square of k sees that roughness. It refuses to let opposite directions hide the real intensity. So whenever you hear me say omega² or k², I want you to think of effort that does not cancel. Think of tired legs. Think of a heart that has been beating all day. Even when one beat is followed by a relaxation, the total work keeps piling up. Second, let us look again at the idea of quadratic forms in very simple language. A quadratic form is just a way of combining squares and cross terms of our letters. Each such combination is like a different way of scoring the activity of a pattern. Think of a football coach watching players on the field. The coach might care about speed, but also about coordination and direction. To rank the performance of a player, the coach may secretly use a formula in their head. 2 times speed plus 3 times accuracy minus 1 times wasted motion. They do not think of it as mathematics, but it is. They are forming a weighted sum of different measures of activity. Nature, in the Holophase picture, may be doing something similar, but with deep consistency and simplicity. It scores patterns of phase according to some simple quadratic combination of time change and space change, and perhaps other derivatives. The patterns with good scores are stable and appear in reality. The patterns with bad scores quickly decay. This again is falsifiable. In the lab, you can propose a candidate score function built from omega, k, and the relatives. You can then check whether the patterns that actually persist in your system indeed minimize or balance this score. If they do not, your proposed quadratic form is wrong. You must refine the language. Third, let us be honest about the limits of our description. Right now, we are only using first derivatives, omega and k, and their squares. Real systems involve many more players: second derivatives, mixed derivatives, topology, and so on. The true action of a physical system may be a rich expression that lives high in the master tree. But beginning with these simplest squares is like learning to read the emotional tone of a sentence. You may not yet understand the full grammar, but you can hear whether a sentence is shouted, whispered, or sung. Omega² and k² tell you, in a first approximation, whether the universe is shouting or whispering at a particular point. Fourth, let us connect once more to emotion and experience. Because the Holophase language is not only a language for cold physics. It is also, in principle, a language that describes your inner life. When you feel deep calm, your whole body and nervous system are in a low activity state. Brain waves are smoother, heart rate is steady and moderate, muscles are relaxed. In the phi language, many of the relevant omega² and k² measures are small. Patterns change because life never fully stops, but they change gently. When you feel panic or intense excitement, many of those measures spike. Brain rhythms may become more synchronized at higher frequencies. Heart rate increases, muscles tense. In the phi language, many omega² sliders are pushed high. Spatial activity also rises as signals race through neural and bodily networks. What you call how I feel is tightly bound to patterns of activity in this underlying language. That means that the holophase code is not some distant abstract thing. It is running through the entire story of your day. When you rest, when you love, when you fear, when you learn, the activity levels of phi are being tuned across the landscape of your body and mind. Finally, let us return, just for a moment, to the picture of the master tree that sits at the center of episode 6. At the root is phi. Above it, the first branches, omega, k, d phi, v. Above them, second derivatives, topology, waves, and more. Hanging off the lower branches, like small but important fruits, are these quadratic activity measures. If I could show you the image while you listen, I would highlight those fruits in a soft color. They are small, but they feed everything. From them grow ideas of energy, of action, of stability, of resonance. Later books and episodes will develop these fully. For now, I want you to leave this part with a simple, living intuition. Whenever you see motion, wave, or structure, you are seeing not only a pattern in phase, but also a certain level of activity in the language of phase. The holophase language is not written in ink. It is written in intensity. It is written in how strongly, how rapidly, how boldly the phase moves and twists. Hold that in your heart as we move forward. In the next part of our journey, we will begin to connect these ideas of activity and intensity to the way the universe chooses its actual stories. Which knots become particles, which curvatures become forces, which configurations survive, and which fade away. Step by step, the abstract symbols will become concrete, testable, and vividly real. Until then, notice the waves in your tea, the hum of your fridge, the rhythm of your breathing as you fall asleep. Behind all of them, the holophase is speaking. Omega and K are tracing their patterns. Omega² and k² are whispering how intense that speech is. You are listening to the language of reality, whether you know it or not. And together, slowly, we are learning to understand it. In this part, we have taken our first step into the intensity of the language of reality. In the next part, we will keep climbing the master tree, seeing how these simple measures of activity connect to forces, particles, information, and meaning itself.